What's up, kings and queens? It's your boy Dan from Daft Previews, and I'm here once again to give you the most comprehensive NBA player prop preview you are going to see today. Now, we had another winning day yesterday. 2 for 2 on our straight bets. Our badass parlay went down to the last leg, and we fell by 1 assist to one, Mr. Kyrie Irving. But it's still a lot of fun. The BAP shall keep rolling, so drop it in the comments. Hashtag BAP if you're going to ride with me today. Now, let's go. So we're kicking things off with the Indiana Pacers versus the Detroit Pistons. In terms of lineups, we've got Doug McDermott, a game time decision, Simone Fontecchio, and Taj Gibson, all game time decisions in this one. So all the key players are available. Now let's get into it. We'll start with these Detroit Pistons. Looking at Cade Cunningham first. Now, his points prop, 21.5. The matchup's not too difficult here against the Pacers, but it's not an easy one. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, but he has covered in 4 consecutive games against the Indiana Pacers. So that's quite interesting. Having a look at his 3-point market, 1.5's the line. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games and 3 out of his last 4 against the Pacers. So I don't mind that one either. Looking at his assist prop, that line's at 7.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. He's got a difficult matchup, though. The Pacers allow the fewest assist to point guards on the season. Cade has covered in 1 out of his last 4 against the Pacers. If you're interested in his rebound prop, it's 4.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. Matchup's not too bad, and he's covered in his last 2 games against Indiana. Next, we're looking at Jaden Ivey. His points prop, 17.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 10 games. The matchup against the Pacers is a good one, though, and he's covered in 3 out of his last 5 against them. Looking at his assist prop, that line's at 3.5. He's covered this in 7 out of his last 10 games, but he's gone under in 3 consecutive games against the Pacers. Whilst I'm looking at assists, actually, Outlier, they just made an improvement to their website. And check this out. You can now see, game by game, the potential assists within that game, and you can correlate that to his actual assists, which is a pretty wild feature. They have the same thing for rebounds as well. So if you haven't looked at Outlier just yet, I encourage you to look at it now. If you are interested, 7-day free trial in the video description below. I am going to cover most of the key matchups, key players, their form lines, but I'm not going to look for the potential assists and potential rebounds for every single player. We will be here all night. So jump on. It's an absolute free trial. You got nothing to lose. Check it out. Links in the description. So taking a look at Jalen Duren, his points prop, 13.5. Got a tough matchup here against the Pacers. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10 games, and he's covered this in 2 of his last 6 games against the Pacers. Having a look at his rebound prop, that's also a tough matchup. Line's at 12.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10, but he has covered in 2 out of his last 6 against the Pacers. And his most 2 recent games, he finished with 13 rebounds, just covering this line. So, yeah, I'm not feeling Jalen Duren in this one. Having a look at the Indiana Pacers, though, we'll start with Tyrese Halliburton. His points prop, 19.5. So he's covered this in 2 out of his last 10 games. The matchup is a good one against the Detroit Pistons, and he's covered in 3 out of his last 4 against them. Having a look at his assist prop, that's at 10.5, minus 130, 6 out of his last 10. The matchup's not too bad against Detroit. He's covered in 2 out of his last 4, recording 16 and 13 assists in his last 2 games against them. Having a look at Miles Turner now, up against Jalen Duren. His line's at 16.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10. He's covered in 2 out of his last 3 against the Pistons. His rebound props at 7.5. He's covered in 3 of his last 10. That's not great, but rebounded very well in 3 straight games against the Pistons. I want to look at Aaron Naismith in this one. And the only reason I want to look at this is because I'm considering an under for him. And we'll look at his points prop real quick. 14.5, 3 out of his last 10. Nothing crazy happening here. Good matchup, but he's only covered in 1 of 5 against the Pistons. So what I wanted to look at was his rebound prop. So I'm actually looking at taking the under. So check this out. The under has cashed Aaron Naismith rebounds in 9 out of his last 10. The matchup in this one is not good, so there's a chance that he can go over. He has been finishing on 4, so it could be a little bit sweaty. But in head-to-head matchups, he's gone under in 4 out of his last 5 against the Pistons. So wanted to show that because it's something I'm considering. If we look at his rebound chances, you can see he's averaging 8 rebound chances per game. But still, the max he's had is 12 rebound chances, and in that game, still finished with only 4. If we have a look at his chances against the Pistons, he's averaging 6.8 rebound chances per game. The most recent matchup was in December, and in that game, he played 26 minutes. He only had 4 rebound chances and finished on 1 rebound. So, if we look at his last 10 games, he's playing 27 minutes a night. Slight uplift in his rebound chances, but still not able to cover 4.5 rebounds. So that's something I'm going to look into a little bit later, and I wanted to share that with you all. Lastly, let's have a look at Spicy P. Pascal Siakam's points prop is at 21.5. Good matchup against the Pistons. He's only covered in 3 out of his last 10. The last time he played the Pistons, he only scored 20 points. His assist line's at 3.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. He only had 2 assists against the Pistons when they last faced up. And rebound-wise, line's at 7.5. He has been rebounding quite well as of late. 4 consecutive games above this line. 7 out of his last 10. Did only have 4 rebounds against the Pistons last time. So I'm considering taking an under here. And it's his points plus assists. So he does have a good matchup when it comes to points. But he hasn't had too many big scoring games, only 3 of them really. So he's gone under in 7 out of his last 10 when we're looking at his points plus assists. And that last game against Detroit, 20 points and only 2 assists. So it's something I'm considering. I'm not loving it to death, but I've got it down on my short list. Let's jump into the next game. It's the Miami Heat versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. And in this one, Jimmy Butler, Nikola Jovic, game time decision. So very limited markets at the moment. We'll start with Jimmy. See what Jimmy's suffering from firstly. All right, so Jimmy's suffering from a right foot bruise. Interesting. Now, his points line in this one, 22.5, 4 out of his last 10 games. The matchup with the Cavs is a good one for him, but he's covered in 3 out of his last 5, has gone under in his last 2. His assist line, 4.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games, gone under in 3 straight, and covered in 3 out of his last 5. If you look at his rebounds, 5.5, 4 out of his last 10. Great matchup, but he's gone under in 5 consecutive games against the Cleveland Cavaliers. Probably leaning just to an under in his PRA. It's 32.5. He has covered that in 5 of his last 10, gone under in 3 straight. He does have a great matchup in this one, but has gone under in his last 2 games against Cleveland. I figured the questionable status probably leans to the fact that he's not 100% if he does happen to play. And the line in this game, it is -2 to Cleveland. So if he does play, he'll probably get a lot of minutes. But yeah, it's definitely something I'm considering at the moment. Looking at all these Cavs, who do we have? Darius Garland. So Darius Garland, his points prop, 20.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. The matchup against Miami is a somewhat difficult one, and Garland has covered in 2 out of his last 5 against them. His assist line is 6.5. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. He's got a good matchup for assists, but he's only covered this in 2 out of his last 5 games against the Miami Heat. For those interested in his 3-point prop, we're looking at 4 of his last 10 games and only 1 out of 5 games against the Miami Heat. So, yeah, probably leaning to the unders there for Darius Garland, but not with too much confidence. That's just based on the numbers that I see. And the next player we'll look through is Jarrett Allen. So up against Bam Adebayo in this one. Safe to say it's a tough matchup for JA. Now he's covered this line in 6 out of his last 10 games. In 6 games against Miami, he's gone under in 6 consecutive games. So the under for Jarrett Allen is at -115. I'm just going to add this to my short list. Investigate this a little bit further. If we look at his rebound line now, over 11.5. He's gone under in 5 consecutive games, 4 out of his last 10. Matchup's not too bad, but he's only covered in 2 out of his last 6 games against the Miami Heat. So definitely taking the under on the points prop is what I'm leaning towards at the moment. Karis LeVert. Now, I think it only makes sense that we filter out games without Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley. So let's check this out. His last 8 games without D. Mitch and Evan Mobley, Karis LeVert's covered this line 4 out of his last 8. Matchup, not too bad against Miami. Yet to verse the Heat without these 2. Last 5 games against the Heat, he's covered his points prop once. Looking at his assists, lines at 6.5. Woo! That's a lot of consecutive ones there. 7 consecutive games, Karis LeVert has covered this assist prop, which is pretty amazing. In head-to-head matches, he's gone under 5 consecutive times, though. Filtering out games, Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley, we can see that he's covered his assist prop in 7 out of his last games with Evan Mobley and Donovan Mitchell out of the lineup. So I'll investigate that a little bit further, see if I can understand why he hasn't been able to cover his assist prop against Miami. And if I find good enough reasons to bet it, I will. Who else do we have in this game? We've got Georges Niang. I guess his points prop could be of interest. And whilst I load this up for Georges Niang, you can drop in the comment section. Is this one of the most unhealthiest players in the league these days? Like, I watch this guy and I feel like I'd see him in my local social competition, someone with a body shape just like his. So, but this fat boy can get buckets. Now, he's covered in 6 out of his last 7 games. He's covered 10.5 points. A matchup with Miami is not an easy one, but check this out. 2 games against Miami, he's covered 10.5 points both times. In those games, he only played 20 minutes. In his last 10, he's averaging 26.4 minutes per game. In his last 5, he's playing 28 minutes a night. He's taking almost 10 shots per game. Against Miami, when he covered these 2, he attempted 9 shots. So Georges Niang is probably a good one to go over. Look, but at minus 130 odds, I wouldn't get overly excited. But if you're looking at one of those apps where you just have to pick over or under Georges Niang points, it's definitely not a bad play. So let's jump into the next game. It's the Sacramento Kings versus the Toronto Raptors. Now, in this particular game, no game time decisions, which is good, but not both of these teams, the Raptors are the ones who are really running thin. Herter is out for the Kings, but he hasn't been playing a whole lot of minutes at the moment. But notable mentions for the Raptors. They're going to be missing Scotty Barnes, RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickly, Jakob Poeltl. They're missing other players too, but pretty much their 4 best players. So Gary Trent Jr. is probably the best player that they have. And when the Raptors are healthy, Gary Trent Jr. is their 6th man off the bench. So, yeah, it's going to be a difficult one. So if we're looking through the form lines, none of this is going to make any sense to you, right? Because Gary Trent Jr. is going to be the number 1 option. He hasn't had to be the number 1 option at any point in this season. So none of these lines are really going to make sense. He has seen an uplift in his points and minutes, especially with RJ Barrett out, and then even more so when Scotty Barnes is out. I can only imagine what he's going to have to do with Emmanuel Quickly out. The line in this game is only minus 11 for the Sacramento Kings, believe it or not. But look, Gary Trent Jr. has still managed to cover this 19.5 points 3 times in his last 10, which is pretty crazy. Looking at head-to-head matchups, he's gone under in his last 2 as expected because his line is never at 19.5. So in this particular game, he'll probably play 40 minutes, provided it's not a blowout. I'd be interested just to see what kind of numbers does he put up if he plays close to that. So let's say filter down to 38 minutes. His last 10 games where he played more than 38 minutes, he's covered this line in 7 out of his last 10. So I'll pull that figure out of my ass. That 38 minutes, I haven't read that anywhere. I'm just assuming here they've got no depth. He's probably going to get a lot of opportunities. So when he plays at least 38 minutes, he's covered this line 7 out of his last 10. Do what you want with that information because I'm not overly confident in it, but the matchup isn't too bad. We know the Kings don't defend shooting guards very well. They got Keon Ellis. He's a gamey defender, but he's quite small, so Gary Trent Jr. should have an advantage there. So, yeah, I wouldn't be willing to take a punt, to be honest, in this game. But, yeah, Gary Trent Jr. is going to get a lot of shots. Let's just put it that way. Kelly Olynyk, his points prop, 14.5. He does have a tough matchup here. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10. Rebound-wise, lines up back up to 7.5. He's only covered this in 2 out of his last 10. I had taken his under a few times when he finished on 6. But up against the Kings, they've got probably the best rebounder in the league, but they're not a good rebounding team. So I wouldn't feel confident in taking his under based on all this. In terms of assists, he's got a good matchup for assists, but he's covered in 3 out of his last 10. I would assume with no Quickly, Kelly Olynyk would probably have to pick up more of the playmaking side of things, but Bruce Brown could also do that too. So, yeah, a little bit hesitant to bet on that. Jumping into the Kings, we have De'Aaron Fox. So, hopefully you guys know this by now. The Raptors, they limit points to point guards, but they allow a lot of assists. So what we'll see here is, I think, a very similar trend. So Fox, points prop, 27.5, covering in 4 of his last 10. Head-to-head matchups, he's gone under in 3 consecutive games against the Toronto Raptors. The matchup is difficult. Looking at his assists, the Raptors allow the third most assists to point guards on the season. De'Aaron Fox has cleared this in 4 consecutive games now, 6 out of his last 10, and he has covered in 2 out of his last 3 against the Toronto Raptors. I feel like this bet is probably too obvious. You might see some other people putting tips out and bets out for this, but it just feels too good to be true. It doesn't make sense to me, right? De'Aaron Fox's recent performances with assists, excellent. 7, 7, 9, and 10. His matchup is excellent. The Raptors leak a lot of assists. The Kings are favored to win this game. The line's at 231, so it's a pretty game. High scoring game. Great matchup. He's got good recent form. He's got pretty decent form against the opponent. The line's still only 6.5. So I'm not really comprehending that. The sportsbook probably not, especially if this is at minus 106. Like, it doesn't sit right with me. I feel like I don't believe that there are necessarily trap lines. I just feel like the sports books, their model or whatever they're predicting is De'Aaron Fox is most likely to go under, or it's going to be a very sweaty bet. And that probably won't happen, but I've bet these types of bets before where everything just seems to line up, and a lot of the times they don't come off. So if you see anybody back in the 6.5, I don't blame them. Just from my personal experience, this is too obvious to take the bet, and I'm not going to be touching it. But just wanted to share that with you all, just in case you're considering it. I'm not trying to talk you out of it, but I'm not going to be betting it. Looking at his rebound prop, though, good matchup. A 5.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10, 4 out of his last 5. In head-to-head matchups, he's only covered in 1 out of his last 3. Minus a bonus. His line's at 21.5. The matchup against the Raptors is a good one. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. Well, 4 out of his last 6, really. And in head-to-head matchups, 1 out of his last 3 against the Toronto Raptors. Looking at his assist prop, that's at 8.5. It's plus money. He does have a good matchup here. 3 out of his last 10 games, though, and only 1 out of his last 3 against the Raptors. Did have 11 assists against them the last time they played in January. And then his rebound prop, that's at 15.5. My God, 15.5. But he's covered this 5 out of his last 10 games, which is crazy. And he's only covered in 1 out of his last 3 against the Toronto Raptors. So, yeah, lines like this, it's just a little bit too wild for me. I'm not saying to take the under. It's just, that's just a lot of stats. He's covered his PRA in 2 out of his last 3 against the Raptors. 45.5. Yeah, he can definitely do it. You'll probably have to get a triple-double or get close to 20 rebounds in order to make this happen. Have a good matchup, but yeah, not for me, Mr. Sabonis. Let's have a look at Keegan Murray. His points prop 14.5. The matchup's not too bad. He's covered in 5 out of his last 10, and he's covered in 2 consecutive games against the Toronto Raptors. So that's pretty interesting. I don't betting on Keegan Murray, to be honest, but yeah, the numbers aren't awful. His rebound line 6.5. He's only covered this in 2 out of his last 10 games. The matchup's not too bad. He did have 12 rebounds against them last time, and he did go well under the 2 games prior to that. So yeah, I don't know. That seems a little bit sketch to me. Let's jump into the Milwaukee Bucks versus the Boston Celtics. So in this game, I wouldn't bet on it just yet. I'd wait for these players to be confirmed. But Giannis Antetokounmpo, Drew Holiday, and Jaylen Brown are all game time decisions, unfortunately. But the first player we'll look through is Jaylen Brown. So he's been playing like a madman. Ever since he failed terribly in that dunk contest, he's been an absolute beast. Check this out. His points prop, he's covered in 9 out of his last 10 games, which is absolutely wild. Supposedly tough matchup here against the Milwaukee Bucks. But in head-to-head matchups, Jaylen Brown has covered in 3 out of his last 4. Only scored 10 points when they matched up in January. That was a 33-point win to the Milwaukee Bucks. His recent form is absolutely terrific. Can't fault it. His assist prop, 4 out of his last 10 games, 3 out of his last 4 against the Bucks. And then his rebound prop, he's covered that in 6 out of his last 10 games, and he's gone under in 4 consecutive games against the Milwaukee Bucks. So out of curiosity, let's check to see what's going on. Giannis, left hamstring. Jaylen Brown, right ankle sprain. Drew Holiday, right shoulder bruise. But yeah, I'm hoping Jaylen Brown does play because I'd like to take it over on his points based on what I'm seeing. He's just playing so good at the moment. Have a look at Jason Tatum. Jason Tatum, points line's 27.5. He's gotten very close to this, finished on the hook 3 times. But Actually, not even close to that. He finished on the hook once. Finished on 26.3 times. He is covered in 5 out of his last 10 games. In head-to-head matchups, 2 out of his last 4. So he had two 40-point games against the Bucks, and then his last two scored 23 and then 7 points against them. Crazy. His assist prop, 4.5. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10. Does have a tough matchup here. And against the Bucks, he's only covered in 1 out of his last 4. And then his rebound prop, 7.5's the line. He's covered this in 4 of his last 10 games. He's gone under in 4 straight, and 2 of his last 4 against the Bucks. So I don't bet on Jason Tatum often, and based on those numbers, I won't be betting it again. Just way too inconsistent for me. I got Drew Holiday up against his old team here. His points line, 11.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. That right shoulder bruise might impact his ability to shoot. Does have a good matchup here against the Bucks, but last 2 games against the Bucks, he's struggled. And it's not like he wasn't shooting. Check this out. He shot 1 from 8, then he shot 2 from 9. So in the 2 games against the Bucks, he's just shot poorly, but he does have a good matchup. Looking at his assists, that line's at 5.5. Matchup somewhat difficult. He's covered in 5 of his last 10. Did go under in his last 2 games against Milwaukee as well. And his rebounds, 4.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 10, 1 out of his last 2 against the Bucks. So I'm not feeling Drew Holiday. Next one, let's take a look at Damian Lillard. So obviously, if Giannis is, I think I said this last time, if Giannis is a chance to miss this game, just take Lillard's points plus assists perhaps now, because that line's going to skyrocket if Giannis is out. There are certain sports books, I know Bet365, for example, they give you a full cash out option unless that line doesn't move within your favor. But if the line doesn't move, you could always cash your whole bet out for Damian Lillard. So it might be one where you take the Damian Lillard bet now. If Giannis is out, you ride it. If he's in, you might consider cashing it out. But he does have a good matchup in this one. The Celtics been allowing a lot of points to point guards all year. Now, Dame's covered this line 5 out of his last 10 games. In head-to-head matches, he's covered in 1 out of his last 2. The game he went under, he scored 21 points, and that was a 33-point blowout win for the Milwaukee Bucks. Dame only played 2 in that game. He only attempted 12 shots, so he didn't have to do much at all. I'm probably just going to take this bet. Probably going to take it. Just saying. But if you're watching this, I encourage you to take a look. Find a sports book where the cash out option is there. Looking at his assists, though, lines at 6.5. 6 out of his last 10, 4 out of his last 5. He's been a dime god. Now, the matchup's not great, but it's not overly difficult either. He has gone under in his last 2 games against the Boston Celtics, though. But this recent form, terrific. If we just check out potential assists, check that out. In his last 5 games, he's averaging 18.4 potential assists. Now, that puts him in the league of Tyrese Halliburton in terms of potential assists. So that's pretty wild. In those games against the Boston Celtics, he was only 8.5 potential assists. So his potential assists have doubled, right? So he averaged 4.5 assists against the Boston Celtics on 8.5 potential assists. His recent form, he's getting 18 potential assists. And based off these numbers, it means he'll probably land on 8, 9, 10 actual assists. So that's definitely one to consider. I'll look into that a little bit further as well. But this is just how cool this tool is on Outlier, being able to break down their potential assists now. Absolute game changer. So I love that. Rebounds. Dame's line's at 3.5. 7 out of his last 10. It's covered in both matchups against the Boston Celtics, and he does have a great matchup here. So instead of just writing down every single prop for Dame, I'll probably just look at his PRA, to be honest. That could be one, because I don't want to have multiple bets on the same player. We might just look at his PRA, given the points I'm pretty confident in, the rebounds he's done well in, and he's got a good matchup, and his assists, his recent form is just crazy. So how can you not? So I'll take a look at them all anyway. Check the pinned comment if you choose to ride with me. Who else have we got? Giannis Antetokounmpo. Left hamstring strain. Interesting. So he's covered this points line now in 4 consecutive games, 7 of his last 10. Hasn't played a game for 5 days, so hopefully the hamstring is feeling better. In head-to-head matchups, though, has struggled against the Boston Celtics in the past, only covering in 1 out of his last 5. The Celtics allow the fewest points to power forwards on the season. Giannis assists are at 5.5, 6 out of his last 10 games. Tough matchup, covered in 2 out of his last 5 against the Celtics. And his rebound props at 11.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10. He's covered in 3 out of his last 5 against Boston, rebounding well in his last 2 games. All right, jumping into the next one, it's the Utah Jazz versus the Oklahoma City Thunder. So in this one, John Collins, he's a game time decision after getting dunked on by Anthony Edwards. Suffered a concussion there, so he's game time decision. The line is OKC minus 15, so keep that one in mind. Utah will also be missing Jordan Clarkson and Lauri Markkanen in this one. So very limited markets for the Jazz players at the moment. Let's start with Keontae George, though. So his matchup against OKC, it's not overly difficult, but it's not easy. He's covered this line in 5 out of his last 10. He's trending down, but 19.5. He has covered 5 times in his last 10. He's versed the OKC Thunder 3 times this season. Scored 30 points against them once, gone under in the other 2. His assist line's at 4.5. He's covered in 7 of his last 10 and 2 out of his last 5 against OKC. And we'll look at his 3-point market because he's not afraid to put these up, but he's hitting 4 out of his last 10, 2 out of his last 3 against OKC. So he does have a great matchup. Thunder allowing the 3rd most 3-pointers made to point guards on the season. He's averaging 5.7 attempts against OKC in those 3 games. And looking at his last 10, he's averaging 6.6 attempts, but very up and down. All right, jumping into OKC, we'll start with SGA, Mr. 31. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, points prop 31.5. Doesn't have a difficult matchup, but it's not hard. But again, what matchup is difficult for SGA? Now, he's covered this line of 31.5, 3 out of his last 10 games. In his last 10 games, he scored 31 points 3 times. In head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 2 out of his last 6. He's versus Utah Jazz 3 times this season, 30, 31, and 28 points. So I would definitely not take the over on this. His assist numbers lines at 6.5. He's only covered in 1 out of his last 10 games. But in head-to-head matchups, he's covered in 4 out of his last 6. Turning to his rebound prop, that's at 5.5. Has been rebounding well, 7 out of his last 10. Does have a good matchup. And he's covered this line in 4 of his last 6 games against the Utah Jazz. So SGA, I feel like his lines are very, very tight, very sharp. It's difficult to find an edge with him. He's always right around those lines for his points, rebounds, and assists. It's pretty crazy. Let's have a look at J-Dub, Jalen Williams. So his points prop here is 20.5. He's got a good matchup here. The Utah Jazz allow the most points to power forwards on the season. 7 out of his last 10 games. He's hit it in his last 2 games against the Utah Jazz, scoring 27 and 26 points, which is wild. 3 out of his last 7. So I don't mind this. J-Dub, you're going on the short list, my boy. All right. Having a look at his assist prop. 4.5's the line. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. The matchup is great, and he's covered in 4 out of his last 7 against Utah. Looking at his rebounds, 4.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 and 4 out of his last 7 against Utah. Chet Holmgren, the matchup's not too bad for him. Line's at 14.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10. And he's covered in all 3 games against the Utah Jazz this season. Looking at his assist numbers, 2.5. 4 out of his last 10. 2 out of the last 3 against Utah. Rebound-wise, I feel like he's really improved as a rebounder lately because this line keeps moving up. His rebound line's at 9.5. Supposedly tough matchup against Utah, but John Collins might not be able to play in this game. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10, and he went under in all 3 games against the Utah Jazz. So, yeah, I feel like that line's a little bit too high, but if John Collins is not going to be there, there's a good chance that he can grab those. So, I'll tend to wait on that. And then my man is Josh Giddey. So, I'm actually considering his points prop here. 11.5, he's covered in 7 out of his last 10. The matchup against Utah is probably the most difficult matchup anybody has. Yeah. So, shooting guards is the position they defend the best. Josh Giddey, not your prototypical shooting guard, though. Chances are they leave him wide open, to be honest. But 7 of his last 10 he's covered, and he's covered in 6 out of his last 7 against the Utah Jazz. He's played them 3 times this year. He scored 12, 20, and then 8 points. This is a home game for Josh Giddey. So if you're using Outlier, you might want to see how's Josh Giddey going at home. He's covered in 7 out of his last 10 games at home. That's interesting. His assist prop 3.5, 6 out of his last 10, 5 out of his last 7 against Utah. And then his rebound prop 5.5. He's covered in 6 of his last 10 and 6 out of his last 7 games against the Utah Jazz. So that last game against Utah didn't do too much, but prior to that, doing quite well, even just the other 2 games this year. So Josh Giddey, he's got my interest. He's on my short list. So I have to dive into him a little bit further. We're hopping into the Philadelphia 76ers versus the Phoenix Suns. Tobias Harris, he's a game time decision in this game. And so is Bol and Damian Lee. They're not market movers, so we've got some props available. Let's get into it. Tobias Harris, I don't know. Can we all just agree here, if you're up to this point and you're still listening, would you guys feel comfortable if I never looked at Tobias prop lines ever again? Because I'm never going to bet on him. Just let me know in the comment section. But Tobias Harris, points prop 17.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 somehow. And in head-to-head matches, he's covered in 2 of his last 3 against Phoenix. His assist line 3. He's covered in 2 of his last 10 and 1 out of his last 3 against the Suns. Rebound-wise, 6.5, 5 out of his last 10 and 2 out of his last 3 against the Suns. So you're never going to see consistency when you look at his numbers. Tyrese Maxey. So he's had a pretty good run as of late. 3 consecutive games now, scoring 30 points. His line's at 27.5. He's covered in 6 out of his last 10 games. Matchup is a good one against the Suns, but he's covered in 1 out of his last 3 against them. They've only played each other once this year, I believe. Yep, in November, and he scored 22 points. Looking at his assists, 5.5. He's covered in only 2 of his last 10 games. Matchup's not too bad for him. He did have 10 assists the last time they played. No Joel Embiid in this one, though. So could be a tough one to bet. His 3-point market, you're getting plus money for 3.5. 1 out of his last 3 against the Suns. 4 out of his last 10. Having a look at the Phoenix Suns, though, start with Devin Booker. Point signs at 24.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10 games. Matchup's a difficult one against the 76ers, but D-Book don't care. He's covered this in 2 consecutive games against Philly. His assist line's at 5.5. He's covered this in 6 of his last 10. 4 consecutive games in a row. Went under in his 2 games against Philly. His rebound line's at 4.5. He's covered this in 6 out of his last 10. 1 out of his last 2 against the 76ers. So I'm not feeling D-Book. Kevin Durant. He's got a pretty decent matchup here, but his recent form's not great. Check that out. 20, 13, and 11 points in his last 3 games. Still, he's covered in 5 of his last 10. Scored 31 points against Philly last time. His assist line's at 4.5. He's covered that in 5 of his last 10. Went under with 3 assists against Philly. And then his rebound props at 7.5. He's covered this in 6 of his last 10 games. Had 8 assists against 8 rebounds against Philly last time. So he does have a good rebounding matchup. Has rebounded well in his last 2 games. So I don't hate his rebound prop. He is somewhat inconsistent. I feel like you'd probably know by the end of the first quarter whether he's going to get close to this or not. I'd be a little bit hesitant on KD. The one player that I do like at the moment is Bradley Beal. So I was checking his numbers since he came back from injury, and he's actually been pretty decent. So check this out. When does he start playing consistent games? It is here, the 3rd of March. You can see that he starts to string some games together. So points-wise, he's covered in 6 out of his last 10. The matchup, somewhat difficult against Philly. He hasn't played them yet, but 6 out of his last 10, he's covered his points. His assist line of 4.5, he's covered that in 6 out of his last 10. Right? But really, his last 9 games are really all that I'm looking at. So 6 out of his last 9. And then if you look at his rebound numbers, 4.5's the line. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 9 games. But if we take a look at his PRA, line's at 26.5. He's covered this now in 8 consecutive games. 8 consecutive games, Bradley Beal has managed to cover his PRA. And some outputs, other games, big assist numbers. He's had some decent rebounding numbers in there as well. But another one you could potentially look at, just what I'm seeing here, probably points plus assists. The hit rate slightly lower because the games where he hasn't scored well and got assists well, these 2 games here in red, he actually rebounded quite well. So just his all-round game at the moment is somewhat desirable. So the line's at 26.5. He's covered that in 8 consecutive games. He's got a good matchup for assists if you're talking about positionally. If you just looked at assists alone, what was it, 6 out of his last 10, I believe? 6 out of his last 10. Lines at 4.5. It's minus 119. Did finish with 4 assists against Boston, 4 assists against Cleveland as well. So, yeah, so I've taken his name down. I'll look into that a little bit further, but I do like what Bradley Beal has been doing in his last 9 games. Grayson Allen, points prop here is at 12.5. He's playing quite well lately. Check this out. 6 out of his last 7 games, he's smashed this points line. Head-to-head matchups. Only scored 8 points last time against Philly. Played 27 minutes. These days, he's playing 37 minutes a night, taking 10 shots, making quite a few three-pointers as well. So, yeah, Grayson Allen, I don't hate his points prop in this one. 3-point line for him is at 2.5. He's covered that in 6 out of his last 7 games. Made 2 3-pointers last time against Philly, but these days he's averaging 8 attempts per game. And if you only need him to make 3, he's shooting 45% at the moment. So I'd definitely lean to the over in this one. Matchup somewhat difficult. Philly don't allow many 3-pointers. They allow a lot more points inside. So that's what I'd be hesitant to bet on. But Grayson Allen, as of late, he's been absolutely killing it. Yusuf Nurkic, I always look at Yusuf Nurkic, but I'm not a fan of what I'm seeing at the moment. His points line, 10.5. He's getting 4 out of his last 10. Does have a good matchup. Scored 11 points last time he played Philly, but yeah, it's not screaming out to me. Yusuf Nurkic assists, 7 out of his last 10. Had 5 assists against Philly last time. And then looking at his rebound prop, 11.5. He's covered in 6 of his last 10 and only had 9 boards last time. So, yeah. Nurkic, I'm not feeling you today, my boy. We're heading into the Grizzlies versus the Golden State Warriors. Draymond Green's a game-time decision, as well as Moses Moody, Santi Aldama, and Vince Williams. So obviously, Memphis still missing a whole rack of players. Desmond Bane is playing, so that'll be interesting. Let's start with Desmond Bane. So his points prop is 23.5. He just returned from his injury. He's played 2 games now. He scored 22 and 24 points, and they smacked the line right in between those numbers. Matchup, somewhat decent against the Warriors. They're not the best at defending guards. I mean, head-to-head matchups, he did score 26 last time against them, 1 out of his last 4, though. His assist line's at 5.5. He's covered that in 1 of his 2 games since returning from injury. I think I might have said this in the last video where we featured Desmond Bane. I said I'm not willing to bet on him until we see a bit more data because, yeah, this ain't really convincing for me right now. Jaren Jackson Jr., this could be an interesting one, especially if there's no Draymond. His points props at 22.5, 4 of his last 10. Has covered against the Warriors in 2 of his last 6. So, yeah. It's interesting. I'm not willing to take it, though. Let's head into these Warriors. Steph Curry. So, his points prop, 26.5. He's covered in 4 out of his last 10. The matchup with Memphis isn't too bad. In head-to-head matches, he's gone under in 3 consecutive games now, 2 out of his last 5. His 3-point market here is at 4.5. He's covered that in only 3 of his last 10 games. He's got a pretty good matchup, but he's gone under in 5 consecutive games against the Memphis Grizzlies. This is actually pretty crazy. The 4.5 is at minus 35, 135. So you can get an under 4.5 for Steph Curry. You can get that for plus money. So he's gone under in 5 consecutive games against Memphis, and he's gone under in 7 out of his last 10 games. The Warriors are 9.5-point favorites in this one. So there could be some blowout potential. Steph Curry need to make this many threes. I'm going to look into that a bit further. You'd be crazy to take an under in Steph Curry 3-pointers made, but I'm a little fucking crazy. So let's have a look at it. Assist numbers. 5.5's the line. He's covered in 2 out of his last 10. Does have a good matchup. Covered last 2 against Memphis, 2 out of his last 5. Rebounds, 4.5, 6 out of his last 10 in head-to-head matchups. He's covered in 3 of his last 5, and he does have a great matchup here. The Grizzlies allow the most rebounds to point guards on the season. So I don't hate this 4.5. Rechecking that head-to-head. Yeah, it's not too bad, but I think, no, I wouldn't. Even the 4 rebounds, if we're looking for the bat, not too confident in it. I don't mind it, not overly confident in it. Let's check out the cum bucket here. Jonathan Kuminga, his points prop, 18.5. He's covered this in 8 out of his last 10. Only had 16 points against the Knicks in the last game. Somewhat difficult matchup here against the Grizz. But in head-to-head matchups, he has covered in 3 consecutive games against Memphis. So, yeah, I don't mind this at all. And in a game where the Warriors are favored to win, you'd assume that they're going to score about 115 to 120 points, perhaps. And if Steph Curry, I'm not expecting Steph Curry to explode. You could see some strong games from Kuminga, maybe something from Klay Thompson. So I don't mind this. I'm going to look at the 18.5. I might end up in 15 for the bat, but we shall see. So I don't hate that for Jonathan Kuminga. And let's have a look at his rebound line, 5.5. He's covered in 3 of his last 10. He's gone under in 5 straight games. Has gone over in 3 consecutive games against Memphis, though. So that's a little bit interesting. So I wouldn't take the under. There could be something within that matchup. Let's have a look at Klay Thompson. His line's at 16.5. Matchup against Memphis is a difficult one, but he has covered in 5 out of his last 6 games, which is pretty wild. Playing very well off the bench, Mr. Thompson. Head-to-head matchups, 2 out of his last 6, but he's gone under in 4 straight against Memphis. His 3-point line is at 3.5. It's plus money. He's covered that in 7 out of his last 10, but he's only hit in 1 of 6 games against Memphis. Difficult matchup. Memphis, checking it out. They do allow 3-pointers, actually. They do allow them to point guards. They don't allow them to shooting guards, though, but they allow them most to small forwards. So, yeah, I'm not sure about that one. Quick look at Andrew Wiggins. I know a lot of people like to bet on Andrew Wiggins. I see a lot of people get upset with him. Let's check him out. So 6 out of his last 10 games, he's covered this points prop of 12.5. In head-to-head matches, he's covered in 1 out of his last 2. So, yeah, I'm not game enough to take any bet on Andrew Wiggins right now. But let's jump into the last game. It's the Los Angeles Clippers versus the Portland Trail Blazers. So believe it or not, the Clippers have 2 players who are game time, or two players that are game time decisions. It's not Kawhi Leonard, it's not Paul George, and it's not James Harden. Terrence Mann and Norm Powell, both game time decisions. For the Blazers, Jeremy Grant and Matisse Thybulle, game time decisions as well. So having a look at these Clippers, we'll start with James Harden. Now, I don't know if he's fully recovered from his shoulder injury or whatnot, but ever since he got it, he's sucked. So he's gone under his points line 4 consecutive games now. That game against Chicago is when that shoulder injury first appeared. He hasn't been able to cover this line since. Points prop at 15.5. Good matchup here against Portland, though. 5 of his last 10, scored 20 points against them in December. His assist numbers, that's at 8.5. He's covered this in 5 out of his last 10. Had 7 assists against Portland last time. And then his rebound prop, 4.5, 6 out of his last 10. And he had 7 rebounds against Portland. So, look, we can probably take 6 assists for the BAP, depending on what odds we can get for that. But, yeah, I'm not really loving any James Harden props. Lean to his under on his points, but I don't know what his injury status is around there. So, have to research that a bit further. Paul George, tough matchup here against Portland. He has covered in 3 consecutive games, though. Some good form for PG. 4 out of his last 10, 2 out of his last 3 against the Portland Trail Blazers. His assist numbers at 3.5. He's covered in 3 of his last 10, and in all 3 games against the Portland Trail Blazers. Most recently with 8 assists. Rebounds, 5.5. He's covered this in 3 out of his last 10 games. 2 out of his last 3 against Portland, so I'm not feeling that. Check out the Claw. 24.5 is his line. Matchup's not too difficult. He is a difficult one, but not too difficult. 6 out of his last 10 games, he's covered this. 2 out of his last 4 against Portland. His assist line's at 3.5. He's covered this in 5 of his last 10, but has gone under in 4 straight. And he's covered in 3 of his last 4 against Portland. Rebounds, 5.5. 5 out of his last 10. 2 out of his last 4 against the Trailblazers. So, yeah, I'm not feeling that for Kawhi Leonard. What else have we got? Zubac. Let's check out Zoo real quick. I wonder if he's playing more minutes yet. Because I stopped betting on him for a while because his minutes were shit. So, looking at his last 20, yeah, it looks like there's no restriction on him. He's playing games with more than 30 minutes. So let's check him out. His numbers are just all over the place. So, got a good matchup here against DeAndre Ayton, but he's only covered in 3 out of his last 10 games. Against Portland, though, Zubac has been eaten. 5 consecutive games against the Portland Trail Blazers. He's covered 10.5 points. Most recently, scoring 18 points against them in December. And then in October, scored 20 points. So those 2 games were this season. His recent form's a bit all over the place, so I wouldn't know what to do with him, but that form against the opponent is great. Rebounds, lines at 9.5, only in 2 of his last 10, and he's covered in 4 out of his last 5 against Portland. So, yeah, I'm not feeling him. DeAndre Ayton, he's on my watch list every single night now because he's been killing it. His points line has finally increased over 20 points, though, 20.5. He's covered this in 7 of his last 10 games. He does have a difficult matchup. The Clippers allow the second fewest points to centers on the season. In head-to-head matchups, he only scored 4 points when they last matched up in October. He played 23 minutes. He shot 2 from 4. So over his last 10, he's playing 34 minutes a night, taking 16 shots per game. He's connecting on 63% of those. He doesn't get to the free throw line much. He doesn't shoot many three-pointers. So he's making 10.2 field goals per game and 1.8 free throws per game. So he's averaging about 22 points per game over his last 10. I'm still going to look into this a little bit further because this recent form is not a fluke. Activity is up, shot percentage is up. So I'll investigate that a bit more. Rebound numbers, his line's at 12.5. He's covered in 6 of his last 10. Another difficult matchup. He had 12 rebounds last time against the Clippers, though. 12.5 at plus money. I'm not overly confident. We could even just look at points plus rebounds, perhaps, for DeAndre Ayton. Let's check that out. 6 of his last 10. Yeah, difficult matchup. It's not too convincing. Probably made me more confused, really. Anthony Simons. His points props at 23.5. He's covered in 3 out of his last 5. 2 out of his last 4 against the Clippers. Assists, we've got 6.5. He's covered in 7 of his last 10. Got under in 4 straight against the Clips. And his 3-point market's at 3.5. 8 out of his last 10. Pretty juicy. And 2 out of his last 4 against the Clippers. So, yeah, in this particular game, nothing's screaming out to me, which is good. I am going to look into DeAndre Ayton, but outside of that, I'm not very aroused. So I'm sorry to say. Pumping the brakes real quick on this video. A couple of announcements. We are getting closer to 5,000 subscribers. It's been raining in at the moment. As I record this, we're on 4,865. We've gotten 100 subs in a video before, but either today or tomorrow, by the time you're watching this, we should be at 5,000 subscribers. So it's a massive achievement. We're going to hit it probably 9 days earlier than I would have expected to. So I wanted to say thanks to you all. I've also previewed the NRL games, which are the Australian version, I guess, of our football here. And from the games this weekend, there's 8 games. There's 3 head-to-heads that I would say are locks. I do have a parlay for them. I'm not creating a video for this, but I thought I would share it with you guys if you're interested in taking a bet. So I'll leave those 3 teams in the description below. You can either put all 3 together, or in the games that they do play, if you do happen to create a multi on that day, you might want to add the money line win for those teams. So I've got a parlay for 3 locks in the NRL if you're interested. But outside of that, I've got to dive in, do some more research. I've got to come up with some single bets for you guys if you choose to tell me. We're going to put together another BAP. So put in the comment section, #BAP, if you choose to ride with me. If not, I'll just go fuck myself. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace!
Sub to the channel cause your boy's getting busy. Coming to your line from the west side of Sydney. We've got the free picks and the juice on the daily. It's all free, you don't even have to pay me.